3 days after billionaire Edward Whitmore was buried, his son Daniel found a note hidden inside his father's locked desk. There were only 5 words. Never let Daniel meet him. The man Edward was warning him about wasn't a rival. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't even rich enough to own the building he worked in. His name was Samuel Carter, a poor former Whitmore employee who had been blamed for a factory fire that killed 7 people 27 years earlier. Daniel had grown up believing Samuel was responsible. But now his dead father was warning him to stay away from the man. And Daniel had one question his father had taken to the grave. If Samuel was really guilty, why had Edward secretly supported him for 27 years? Daniel was about to walk into a tiny repair shop and discover that the man his father feared most wasn't Samuel. It was the truth. Edward Whitmore's funeral had been everything Daniel expected. Too large, too formal, too polished. Hundreds of people filled the church. Executives from companies Edward had built, politicians who had once asked him for favors, former employees who remembered him as a demanding but fair employer. People stood one after another and described Edward as decisive, visionary, a man who never backed away from a difficult choice. Daniel listened from the front row. He had heard those words his entire life. His father had always taught him that leadership meant making decisions other people couldn't understand. Sometimes you had to protect the larger picture. Sometimes one person's pain had to be weighed against the lives of thousands. Daniel had believed him. Why wouldn't he? Edward had built an enormous manufacturing company from almost nothing. He had given Daniel a childhood most people could only imagine. And even though Edward had been demanding, Daniel had never doubted one thing. His father loved him. 3 days after the funeral, Daniel went into Edward's private office. He wasn't looking for secrets. He was looking for something ordinary. A personal notebook, a family photograph, anything that would make the room feel less empty. Instead, he found a locked drawer in the old wooden desk. The key was taped underneath. Inside were 3 things: an old employee identification card, a photograph, and a folded piece of paper. Daniel picked up the identification card. A younger man stared back at him. Thin face, dark hair, work shirt. The name underneath read, Samuel Carter. Daniel frowned. He had never heard the name. He unfolded the paper. His father's handwriting was unmistakable. 5 words. Never let Daniel meet him. Daniel stood perfectly still. He read it again. Then he turned the paper over. Nothing. No explanation. No date. He checked the drawer again. Nothing else. He searched the company's digital records. Samuel Carter had worked at Whitmore Industries 27 years earlier. Maintenance supervisor. Then Daniel found the incident report. A factory fire. 7 employees dead. The official conclusion blamed Samuel. He had supposedly ignored electrical warnings and failed to shut down a dangerous section of the plant. Samuel had been fired. His career was destroyed. The company survived. The story had ended there. At least that was what Daniel had always believed. But the note in his father's desk had been written recently. Not 27 years ago. Months before Edward died. His father had been thinking about Samuel until the end. Daniel searched for an address. He found one, a tiny repair shop on the edge of town. The next morning, Daniel drove there. The building looked nothing like the places he was used to entering. The paint on the door had faded. The front window was crowded with old clocks and repaired radios. A small brass bell rang when Daniel opened the door. An elderly man behind the counter looked up. His hands were working on a watch. Then he saw Daniel. The watch stopped moving. The man's face changed. "You are Edward's son." Daniel nodded. He placed the employee card on the counter. Samuel looked at it. Then Daniel put the note beside it. Samuel didn't touch the note. "Where did you get that?" My father's desk. Samuel looked away. Then you shouldn't be here. Why? Because Edward told you not to come. He's dead. I know. Then he can't stop me. Samuel finally looked at him. That's what he was afraid of. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Afraid of what? Samuel folded the note. Go home. Daniel didn't move. Did my father know you were innocent? Samuel's expression hardened. Go home. Daniel left, but he returned the next morning. Samuel refused to speak. Daniel came back the day after that. Again, Samuel refused. On the fourth visit, Daniel arrived without his driver, without his security detail, without the expensive coat he normally wore. He sat in an old wooden chair across from Samuel. I don't want money, Daniel said. Samuel kept working. I don't want revenge. Nothing. I want to know why my father told me never to meet you. Samuel's hands stopped. For several seconds, the only sound in the shop was the ticking of an old wall clock. Then Samuel said, You think understanding will make this easier? No. Then why are you here? Daniel thought about lying. Instead, he told the truth. Because he told me not to come. Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something Daniel wasn't expecting. You're still trying to decide whether your father was a good man. Daniel said nothing. Samuel returned to his watch. That's the wrong question. Daniel left with no answer. But now he had something more troubling than an answer. A new question. What had Edward done that made Samuel refuse to defend him? Daniel started with the factory fire. He requested the original records. At first, everything confirmed what he remembered. 7 workers had died. Samuel had been the maintenance supervisor. The official report blamed him. But Daniel noticed something strange. The report described several electrical warnings as if they had been discovered only after the fire. The original maintenance logs told a different story. Samuel had reported the problems weeks earlier, then again, and again. Daniel found 6 separate requests for repairs. Everyone had been delayed. The last warning was dated 2 days before the fire. Daniel kept reading. The final inspection report carried a signature. Not Samuel's. Charles Whitmore, Edward's younger brother. Daniel remembered Charles only vaguely. He had disappeared from the family business before Daniel was old enough to understand why. Daniel searched the old corporate records. Charles had controlled a major division of the company. There were unusual financial transfers, safety complaints, missing inventory, employee reports that had been quietly closed. The deeper Daniel looked, the less the official story made sense. He returned to Samuel. You knew about Charles. Samuel continued repairing a clock. You warned my father. Silence. You knew the factory wasn't safe. Samuel put down the screwdriver. Leave it alone. Daniel placed copies of the maintenance records on the counter. My father knew. Samuel looked at the papers. Yes. The answer came so quietly that Daniel almost missed it. My father knew you didn't cause the fire? Yes. Daniel felt anger rising, and he still let everyone believe you did. Samuel didn't deny it. Yes. Why? Samuel's eyes remained on the papers. Because there are things you don't understand yet. Daniel leaned closer. Then help me understand. No. Why? Because you are already looking for someone to hate. Daniel froze. Samuel continued. And if I tell you everything now, you'll choose the easiest person. My father? Samuel said nothing. Daniel took the papers and left. Now Daniel had a theory. And this time, he wanted it to be wrong. But the evidence kept pushing him toward it. He found Edward's signature on the final report. His father had approved the document that publicly blamed Samuel. Daniel stared at the signature. There was no ambiguity. Edward had known, and he had signed anyway. Daniel returned to Samuel. He put the report on the counter. My father signed this. Samuel looked at it. Yes. He knew you were innocent? Yes. He destroyed your reputation? Yes. Daniel's voice shook. Then why are you protecting him? Samuel looked directly at him. I'm not protecting Edward. Then what are you doing? Trying to stop you from believing the wrong thing. Daniel almost laughed. What's the wrong thing? Samuel's answer was quiet. That your father did it because he didn't care what happened to me. Daniel stared at him. You let everyone hate you. Yes. You lost your job. Yes. You lost your family. Samuel's eyes changed. Daniel noticed. He had finally touched something Samuel didn't want touched, but Samuel said nothing. Daniel walked out. For the next several days, he investigated Edward's brother. Charles's shadow began appearing everywhere. A former employee had resigned without explanation. Another had moved out of state. A third refused to discuss the fire even decades later. Then Daniel found a handwritten note inside an old personnel file. Only 4 words. Charles knows who talked. Daniel read it twice. The factory fire suddenly looked less like an accident and more like the end of a chain of fear. Daniel discovered that Samuel had reported Charles's misconduct to Edward shortly before the fire. Not just financial misconduct. Dangerous materials were being moved through the factory without proper documentation. Safety procedures were being bypassed. If exposed, the scandal could destroy the company. Edward had confronted Charles. 2 days later, the factory burned. Daniel's theory hardened. His father had faced a choice. Protect the Whitmore company, or protect Samuel. Edward had chosen the company. Daniel believed that now. He believed his father had deliberately sacrificed an innocent man to protect the family name. Then he found another record. It changed the question. After the fire, Charles had started looking for Samuel. Not officially. Quietly. Someone had checked Samuel's home. Someone had tracked his movements. Someone had asked where Samuel kept his original maintenance records. And then the searches stopped. Daniel followed the trail. The person who had intervened was Edward. Daniel sat alone in the archive room for a long time. His first theory had been simple. Edward sacrificed Samuel to save the company. Now there was another possibility. Edward had sacrificed Samuel's reputation to save Samuel's life. But Daniel wasn't ready to forgive him. Not even close. He returned to the repair shop. Samuel looked at him and immediately knew. You found something. My father stopped Charles from finding you. Samuel said nothing. He let everyone believe you caused the fire. Yes. But he protected you afterward. Yes. Daniel shook his head. How can both things be true? Samuel looked at him. They can. Did you forgive him? No. The answer was immediate. Then why didn't you expose him? Samuel glanced toward an old wooden drawer. Because there are debts that aren't paid with money. Daniel followed his eyes. The drawer was old, worn around the edges. Samuel opened it. Inside was a small birthday card. The envelope had turned yellow with age. On the front, in a child's handwriting, was one word. Dad. Samuel picked it up. Daniel didn't touch it. Your daughter? Samuel nodded. When was this? 6 years after the fire. Daniel waited. Samuel looked at the card but didn't open it. She wanted to know why I never came home. Daniel swallowed. What did she believe? Samuel's eyes remained on the envelope. That her father had killed 7 people. Silence. Did you ever tell her the truth? Samuel shook his head. She deserved to know. Maybe. Then why? Samuel finally looked at him, because by then, the truth wasn't going to give her her father back. Daniel didn't know what to say. Samuel put the card away. My family had already decided who I was. And Edward? Samuel looked toward the window. Edward decided who I had to become. That sentence stayed with Daniel. He went back to his father's records. This time, he wasn't looking for proof that Edward was innocent. He was looking for the price Edward had paid for his decision, and he found it. For 27 years, Edward had been sending Samuel money, medical expenses, shop repairs, rent, personal transfers, never through the company, never publicly, never for recognition. Daniel stared at the records. His father had spent 27 years quietly supporting the man whose life he had publicly destroyed. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it proved something Daniel hadn't wanted to admit. Edward had never forgotten what he had done. Daniel went back to his father's office. He searched every drawer, every file, every locked cabinet. Eventually, he found one envelope. His name was written across it. For Daniel, if he ever meets Samuel. Daniel opened it. The letter was in Edward's handwriting. It didn't begin with an apology. It began with the truth. Edward admitted Samuel was innocent. He admitted the report had been altered. He admitted he had allowed Samuel to take the blame. He admitted Charles had become dangerous. And he admitted something Daniel hadn't expected. He had told himself for years that sacrificing Samuel's reputation was the only way to save his life. But Edward knew that wasn't the whole truth. He had also been afraid of losing the company, afraid of destroying the Whitmore name, afraid of admitting that he had allowed Charles's misconduct to continue for too long, afraid of becoming the man everyone would blame. So he made a decision. He saved Samuel from Charles, and then he made Samuel carry the shame. Edward wrote, "I told myself I was choosing the lesser evil." Daniel stopped reading. Then, "The problem with the lesser evil is that someone still has to live with it." Daniel continued. Edward explained that he had wanted to confess many times, but every year the consequences seemed larger. The company employed thousands. People depended on it. Families depended on him. And every year, Edward told himself that revealing the truth would hurt too many innocent people. So he kept waiting, until waiting became a habit, until silence became easier than courage. Then came the line Daniel had been trying to understand since finding the note. "I wasn't afraid you would hate me, Daniel." A pause. "I was afraid you would understand me." Daniel lowered the letter. He suddenly understood. His father hadn't been afraid Daniel would learn that Samuel was innocent. He had been afraid Daniel would discover that Edward's decision wasn't simple. Edward had protected Samuel's life. He had also protected himself. He had done something courageous for one reason and cowardly for another. And those two truths had lived inside him for 27 years. Edward continued. "Samuel lost his reputation, his marriage, and the trust of his children. I lost none of those things. That is why I never allowed myself to believe we had paid the same price." Daniel wiped his eyes. Then he read the final paragraph. Never let Daniel meet him. Now the meaning was clear. Edward wasn't afraid Samuel would expose him. He was afraid Daniel would see the one thing Edward couldn't hide behind wealth. Samuel had lost almost everything, and somehow he had remained decent. Edward had kept everything, and still couldn't forgive himself. Daniel folded the letter. For the first time, he understood why his father had carried the secret to his grave. Not because the secret was simply that Samuel was innocent. That part was almost easy. The real secret was that Edward had known what was right, and still been too afraid to do it. But Daniel wasn't finished, because the truth had created a new choice. The board wanted silence. Lawyers warned him about lawsuits. Executives warned him about the company's future. One senior executive told him, "Your father spent 27 years protecting this company." Daniel looked at him. "Maybe that's why I can't." The executive frowned. "Can't what?" "Make Samuel pay again." Daniel returned to the repair shop. Samuel was working at his bench. Daniel stood quietly for a moment. I found his letter. Samuel didn't look up. What did he say? The truth. Samuel nodded. Daniel sat down. I still don't know what the right choice is. Samuel put down his tool. Good. Daniel looked at him. Why is that good? Because your father always thought he knew. Daniel almost smiled. Then he asked, What would you do? Samuel looked at the drawer containing his daughter's birthday card. I already made my choice. You stayed silent. Yes. Would you do it again? Samuel thought for a long time. No. That was enough. Daniel chose the truth. But he refused to turn it into revenge. He released the original maintenance records. Samuel's name was cleared. The altered report was exposed. Edward's role became public. Charles's misconduct was finally acknowledged. But Daniel made sure innocent employees weren't punished for decisions made decades earlier. He didn't destroy the company. He didn't protect the family name either. He simply stopped asking another man to carry the burden. The story of the factory fire changed. Samuel's name was finally cleared. Families of the 7 workers received the truth they had waited decades to hear. And Edward's reputation became complicated. Some called him a coward. Some called him a protector. Daniel didn't use either word. He knew better now. A man could save someone's life and still destroy that person's future. A man could love his family and still make a terrible choice. A man could spend 27 years regretting something and still never find the courage to undo it. Months later, Daniel returned to Samuel's shop. He placed the newspaper on the counter. Samuel read the headline. His name had finally been cleared. He folded the paper. Feels strange, Daniel smiled. Why? Seeing my name without the word responsible beside it. Daniel looked down. I'm sorry. Samuel shook his head. You didn't do it. My father did. Your father made the choice. They sat quietly. After a moment, Daniel asked, Did you ever forgive him? Samuel looked toward the window. No. Daniel waited. But I understood him. Daniel nodded. What's the difference? Samuel considered the question, then said, Understanding someone doesn't mean deciding they were right. Daniel looked at him. It just means you finally know why they were wrong. Samuel put the newspaper aside. Daniel stood to leave. Before he reached the door, he looked back. When you first saw me, you knew who I was. Samuel nodded. Did you know I'd find everything? No. Then why were you so afraid of me? Samuel smiled faintly. I wasn't afraid of you. Daniel waited. I was afraid you'd become him. Daniel froze. Samuel continued. Your father believed power meant carrying responsibility for everyone. A pause. But sometimes he used that responsibility to decide what other people were allowed to lose. Daniel understood. His father had spent 27 years believing that protecting people gave him the right to choose who would suffer. Daniel had finally learned otherwise. He stepped outside. The tiny repair shop disappeared behind him. And for the first time since Edward's funeral, Daniel no longer wondered whether his father had been a good man or a bad one. That question had never mattered. The truth was harder. Edward had been a man who loved his son, a man who protected a life, a man who built an empire, a man who was brave enough to confront danger, and a man who, when the final price came due, was not brave enough to pay it himself. That was the secret Edward had carried to his grave. Not simply that Samuel was innocent, not simply that Charles was corrupt, not simply that Edward had hidden the truth. The real secret was that Edward had once been given a choice between protecting a man's life and protecting his own name. He chose the man's life. Then he spent 27 years wishing he had been brave enough to protect both. He wasn't. So Samuel paid the price, and Daniel inherited the debt. But Daniel refused to pass it on. Because a man's legacy isn't the company he builds. It isn't the money he leaves behind. It isn't the name carved above a doorway. Sometimes a man's real legacy is the mistake his child finally refuses to repeat. Daniel had entered Samuel's tiny store looking for his father's secret. He left understanding something far more painful. His father hadn't hidden the truth because he didn't know what was right. He had hidden it because he knew, and was afraid of what doing the right thing would cost. And that was why Edward Whitmore had written those 5 words. Never let Daniel meet him. Because Edward knew that if his son ever met Samuel Carter, Daniel wouldn't just discover what his father had done. He would discover the man his father had failed to become. And in the end, that was the one truth Edward had never been able to bury. Power can make someone else carry your burden. Courage is deciding that the burden is yours. Some stories end with answers. The ones that matter most begin with understanding. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more untold stories. Until our next untold story, take care.